Hey, this is Sarah. I'm going to walk you through the process of installing ECS and Delta onto a server. So just to give you a brief overview of ECS and Delta EDI software, it is an on-premise software application. That means that you need to have a server designated to install it on, and it does require a Windows server. There are other server requirements that are detailed in the ECS install documentation that you can look at. But for now, we're going to assume that we have a Windows server set aside and allocated that does meet those requirements. And by the way, that server can be a virtual machine as well. The virtualization platforms that are supported by ECS and Delta are also outlined in the in ECS Delta install guide. So I'm going to open up our Windows server that we're installing on today. And as you can see, this is truly a clean server. We haven't installed anything on it yet. Typically, the first thing that I'll install ahead of the ECS and Delta software would be the Chrome browser. The reason being that the Chrome browser is supported or supports the ECS web UI. The jury's still out on whether Microsoft Edge supports it, so I find that it's easier to download Chrome, and then we're guaranteed that it will support it, as well as the eService website that we're going to download our ECS and Delta software from. Just runs and looks a little bit better in Chrome. So I'm going to go ahead and just install Chrome for Windows, the web browser, onto this brand new server. Looks like somebody may have already tried to install that on here. So we'll go ahead and launch that install together. And we'll just give it a moment to finish installing. And there's our Google Chrome. I'm not going to sign in. I just want the browser. I don't need to set it as a default at this time, though of course you can if you so choose. And there's Google Chrome. So I'm going to actually close Microsoft Edge and I'm going to use Google Chrome going forward to navigate. Just like I said, that does make it a little bit easier to work with, for example, the eService website that we're going to download our software applications from, as well as the ECS web UI, which we'll get to later once I've installed the software. So for now, our first step in ensuring that the preliminary requirements are met to install ECS and Delta is going to be to install SQL Server. For purposes of this demo, we're going to install the free version of Microsoft SQL Server, which is SQL Server Express. There are certain versions that are supported by ECS and Delta. You should always make sure that your SQL Server version is supported before you install it and expect it to work with ECS. And I'll show you how to verify that in a minute. There's a couple different options that it gives us. It wants to install on-premise. We're going to install just a SQL Server Express, which you have to scroll down the page to find. Going to go ahead and hit that install now or download now button, and it's going to download our SQL Server Express install. I'm just going to show you within the installation guide for ECS here that SQL Server 2022 is a supported SQL Server version for ECS. So we did verify that up front before we decided to install that version. It is, again, important that you install a version that's going to be compatible with ECS. So I'm going to go ahead and launch my install and install SQL Server Express on here. Again, this is the free version of SQL Server. And it does impose a database size limit that we'll talk about in a second. I'm just going to do the basic install. And I'm going to hit accept here to accept the licensing agreement. I'm going to accept my default install location and hit the install button. It should be pretty straightforward. So SQL Server Express, again, is the free version of Microsoft SQL Server. We don't typically recommend it for actual ECS Delta installations in the wild because it imposes a 10 gigabyte database size limit. So that means that if your database size gets above 10 gigabytes, SQL Server will essentially shut down. And that can be very bad if you're running your ECS Delta EDI applications. Since they are dependent upon SQL Server to store their data, you don't want that to happen. So again, we don't recommend Express for an actual install, but because this is just a test install and because it's the free version, that is why I'm installing SQL Server Express. It will install as what we call a named instance of SQL Server, and I'll walk you through what that means in a little bit when we're performing our additional configuration steps to prepare it for use with the ECS Delta applications. So we're just going to let SQL Server 2022 Express Edition fully download and install. I believe we're going to find also that SQL Server Management Studio is not automatically installed, and that is a component that we recommend, if not require, that you install on your ECS server. So if that's not installed as part of this Express installation, then we'll go ahead and download and install SQL Server Management Studio as a separate step in a moment here. You do, of course, want to make sure that you have admin rights to the server when you're installing things like this, especially like a database server like SQL Server is going to require full admin rights for you to install that on your target server. So be aware of that as well and of your Windows permissions. Otherwise, you're likely to run into install issues, if not with SQL Server, and then with ECS and Delta further on down the line. That install does take a little bit of time to run. SQL Server is, of course, a database provider, so it's there's a lot of components to it that do need time to install on your target server. Looks like it's getting towards the end of the install, though. It's nearly finished. Again, we'll likely need to install SQL Server Management Studio, but we will just take a quick look at the installed components to verify that that's not included already. So these we typically don't need to do anything with. We can just let these be their default values. Again, if you are installing SQL Server, the full edition rather than the Express edition, you'll probably have a database administrator who's assisting you with this process, and they will fine-tune these sorts of configurations to what is optimal for your environment. So feel free to rely on them and their expertise. This isn't intended to be a review of how to install Microsoft SQL Server, but just kind of a light overview of how to install it to work with ECS. So it does give me the option to install, it says SSMS, that stands for SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that option because I do want to install that. It's going to say, what browser do you want to open that in? I'll just go ahead and use Google Chrome for now because we did go to the trouble of installing that browser. Again, you could use Microsoft Edge for this part. It really doesn't matter. And here is the download for SQL Server Management Studio. You got to scroll down the page a bit and then you'll see it. So I'm going to go ahead and click that link to download it. And I can see up here that that is in the process of downloading. It says the download is in progress. I can click that to see, and it looks like it's done. So I'm going to go ahead and install the SSMS, which is SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to double click that to install it. It should launch an install screen. And we can let that install in its default location. Again, I'm not a database administrator, so this some of this configuration could be different for your environment depending on what your DBA wants to do. But this is just kind of a generic SQL Server install that we're going to use with ECS and Delta. SQL Server is going to be ECS and Delta's data repository. That means it's the back end where all data, including configuration data, as well as your EDI data flowing through the ECS and Delta applications, is going to be stored. SQL Server Management Studio is basically going to be your window into the SQL Server application. From Management Studio, you're going to be able to see your databases. Once we do install ECS, 2 databases are going to be created on Microsoft SQL, on your Microsoft SQL Server instance. An ECS database that's called your primary or core ECS database, and then an ECS archive database that can be used to move legacy data and essentially so that you don't have to store all of your data within your primary or core SQL Server. That's useful, especially if you're dealing with like disk space limitations and so on. And it also, you don't want to store too much data in your ECS core database just because it can slow down performance in ECS when you do that. So good reasons to archive and use that archive database. And we'll discuss that a little further when it comes to the actual ECS install. So you can see Management Studio is just about done installing. Should be done in just a second here. Looks like it's still working on that. Okay, and then Management Studio install has completed, so we're going to go ahead and click the close button on that install. Here's our Express Edition screen. I can go ahead and either connect now. We already installed SSMS, which is SQL Server Management Studio, but right now I'm going to hit the close button. And it's going to say, are you sure you want to exit? I'm going to go ahead and hit no here and just make sure that we've done everything that we need to do. I think we're in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and hit yes to exit. And as my next step, I'm going to go ahead and configure our SQL Server install so that it's ready for ECS. We want to do that configuration before we perform the ECS and Delta installs. Before I work on that configuration, just as a background task, I'm going to go to the ECS eService website. This is where you download ECS and Delta. And I'm going to go ahead and log in under ECS and Delta credentials. Or actually eService mailbox credentials, which are going to be separate from your ECS Delta credentials that we'll discuss in a moment. Typically, these mailbox IDs are going to be a number consisting of 4 to 5 numeric digits. I'm not going to save this, but you do need login credentials to get into the eService website where you're going to download your ECS and Delta software from. So under the eService website, I'm going to go to Products, and I'm going to go to ECS Enterprise. And I'm going to start my ECS download first because that takes the longest of the two downloads, ECS and Delta. I'm going to hit that download button. It does say insecure download blocked. That's a Chrome thing. It's not a ECS or Delta thing. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to download that file all the same. I think it has to do with the signing certificate. So it's nothing to be alarmed about, but it is something to be aware of. And just make sure that you click all the way through to that install. I'm going to hit the products link again, and this time I'm going to go to Delta. And typically you're going to be installing on a 64-bit system. If you're not sure, you can check your system information and just make sure that that's a 64-bit system. I haven't seen a 32-bit system in a long time, so I think we can be pretty sure that it is, but we'll go ahead and take a look just to be thorough. Here it is, 64 base PC. That means it's 64-bit. So we're going to download our 64-bit version of Delta. We can see those downloads running. I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to fully install or fully download Delta. Looks like it's trying to block my download, so I need to take care of that. And it looks like it may not give me the option to take care of completing that Delta install until the ECS install completes. So we'll go ahead and let that ECS download complete, and then we'll go ahead and say that we want to download the Delta install package as well. So we'll come back to that in a moment. I know I said that I was going to go ahead and configure my my SQL Server in order to accept connections from ECS and to work correctly with ECS. So while we're waiting for that ECS download to complete and to be able to complete that Delta download, we'll go ahead and switch gears and work on the SQL Server configuration portion of this. Go ahead and do that. By the way, the ECS and Delta install guide here under products, ECS, and I believe there's a link under the Delta download as well, but here's the install guide. You can take a look at this, and this will give you the same details that I'm going over here and let you know how to get your server set up for ECS, including the SQL Server setup that is required, and then how to install Delta and ECS as well. So just want to let you know that that's there. The portion of the guide we're going to be going over is this one here. We're going to start out with our SQL Server configuration. So I'm going to go into SQL Server Network configuration, which since we just installed SQL, it's going to be here under recently added. But otherwise, I believe it's down here on the menu, SQL Server 2022. Here it is, Configuration Manager. That's what we want to open. Again, this does require admin perms to run, so be sure that you're aware of that. And the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at our newly installed SQL Server instance. So here under SQL Server Services, I can see my services are running and what they're running under. And I can verify that my install completed correctly. And the next thing that I'm going to do is go down to my protocols, which is under SQL Server Network configuration. I'm going to choose protocols for SQL Express. And this TCP/IP protocol is extremely important to enable. For whatever reason, it's not enabled by default when you install SQL Server Express. I think that that's different if you install the full version of SQL Server. So you may not have to do that if you're running full SQL Server. But in this case, it's not running. So we're going to double click that to look at the properties and just take a quick look. And we're going to go over here to IP addresses. And we're going to go down to IP all. And we're going to go ahead and delete The 0 from dynamic ports, ECS is not intended to run with dynamic ports. We need to specify a static port to run under. So I'm going to say 1433 because I know that's the default SQL Server port. I'm going to specify that right in this IP addresses tab again of our properties. And it is warning me that we need to stop and restart the service. So we'll do that in a moment. I'm going to hit the OK option here. And then I'm going to make sure that I enable my protocol, the TCP IP protocol. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. It will warn me again that this won't take effect until I restart my SQL Server service. So we'll make sure that we do that. And just taking a look in here, I want to make sure my IP addresses change took effect, and it did. There's my port 1433. We'll use that later. We'll specify it during the ECS install. The next thing we want to do is go up to SQL Server Services. Remember, I said you need to restart the SQL Server service. So I'm going to do that and just hit this restart option to ensure that my TCP IP protocol enable fully takes effect, and that this SQL Server instance that I just installed is ready to accept a TCP IP connection from ECS once I install ECS. So there, we've restarted the SQL Server core service. The next thing we're going to do, because this is what we call a named instance of SQL Server, as all SQL Express instances are, we're going to go ahead and start our SQL Server browser service as well and set it to automatically run with the operating system going forward. So this is disabled currently. What we're going to do is make it automatic instead of disabled. I'm going to hit OK. And then we're going to go ahead and start it. And that takes care of the steps that we need to perform in order to ready the SQL Server for ECS's connections. Another thing that I do typically like to do at this point is just open SQL Server Management Studio and verify that my SQL Server installed correctly and I can actually get to the instance and see it. This is just a wise thing to do before you install ECS, because again, if you run into any issues during the install, you kind of want to narrow those down and know if those are specific to your ECS install or if it's an issue with how you installed SQL Server and maybe the SQL Server is just not accessible. And here you can see my SQL Server defaults. This is what I meant by named instance. The name of the server is ECS. That's the Windows Server name under System Information. Right here, system name is ECS, but then SQL Express is the named instance of SQL Server. So this entire string together creates the name of the SQL Server, or the host name that we use to connect to this instance of SQL Server. Authentication is Windows Auth. I don't believe that SQL Server authentication has been enabled for this SQL Server install. For now, I'm not going to enable it. That's kind of a whole other topic of discussion, but know that ECS has the potential to work with SQL Server authentication as opposed to Windows authentication. Those are just two different ways for users to authenticate themselves to a SQL Server. In this case, every single user that logs into ECS will need SQL Server access. So that is something to keep in mind, and possibly is a good reason to consider setting up SQL Server authentication, because then you can use a single unified SQL Server account for all ECS logins to SQL Server. But again, that's kind of a more advanced topic. So for today, we're just going to use Windows authentication. I'm going to hit the connect option and this should connect. Okay, it says that there was a challenge accepting the connection. So let's take a look at that. I can see that my encryption is set up to be mandatory. So I think I'm going to go ahead and set this to optional and see if that gets me where I need to be. I think that may be a fairly new wrinkle in SQL Server. And so that's important to note, just that I needed to change that setting. Again, the setting that I had to change in that case was that encryption setting, changing it from mandatory to optional. Under here. So we've connected to our SQL Server instance, or SQL Server Express instance rather. We can look at our databases. Of course, there's no ECS or ECS archive database yet, But when we do complete our ECS install, we'll be able to see those databases physically populate in SQL Server Management Studio. So I will leave this running behind the scenes just so we can take a look at that when we do our ECS install. Let's see how those ECS downloads are doing. Take a look. And since I do not see my Delta download, let's retry that and see if we can get that to go through. I'm going to go to products. I'm going to go to Liaison Delta Enterprise. Again, we want that 64-bit install, so I'm clicking that. I'm going to hit the keep option. Let's see about keeping that. And I'm going to go into my full download history to see if I can move that on through. It looks like I may need to download the insecure file from here. So again, that's kind of a Chrome specific thing. I did say Chrome is typically an easier browser, but you know, as things move forward and browsers implement more and more kind of security restrictions, you may run into some things like that. So just something to be aware of. At this point, we have downloaded the Delta and the ECS setup and install exe packages. So now that we've set up our SQL Server database and TCP/IP connection and verified that SQL Server can be connected to from SSMS, which is SQL Server Management Studio, we are ready to go ahead and install ECS and Delta. So we're going to go into our downloads folder. Again, you can move these to a more convenient location if you don't want them sitting in downloads. And you probably do want to archive these someplace where you can get to them later, because it's just good to have your download files available and not have to go back to eService website if you do need to redo it and install or anything like that. I'm going to go ahead and right-click my ECS install here. And I'm going to choose Run as Administrator just to verify that this runs under what we call our elevated Windows Administrator permissions. Of course, since Windows Vista, just because you're logged in as a Windows admin doesn't necessarily mean you're running under an elevated admin permission. So we just choose that option to make sure that we're running under the highest level of admin perms possible. I'm going to click this More Info option. Again, it's trying to not run it. This isn't anything to be concerned about. It's just Windows being extra paranoid. Probably has to do with the security cert that this download file is signed with or not signed with. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Run anyway because we know it's safe. It came from the eService website and there aren't any issues. And it's going to go through some install screens. Here is my first install screen. I'm just going to click past it. I'm going to choose to accept the terms of the license agreement. And again, I'm going to accept this secondary license agreement. And here's where you have to make your first choice in the ECS install. So I'm going to install the server. If you were, after you install the ECS server, you can install an unlimited quantity of ECS clients. That just means that you install the ECS applications that I'll walk you through later. And those applications can then connect back to this server and users in your environment on networked PCs can access the ECS utilities and connect to the ECS server. So we're going to install again the server install of ECS. Your first installation will always be a server install. We're going to hit next here. We'll just let it install to the default C ECS directory on this server. I'm going to hit next, and here's where we put our user information. So you put your name here, your company name here, and you're going to put your ECS serial number here. Make sure that you choose the proper serial number, because it says serial number in your documentation. You need to make sure it's formatted with hyphens. So this is the serial number that I'm pasting in from the email that we received from Liaison. I'm just going to hit the next option and register online. And we'll go ahead and enter our address information here. Typically, we want to make sure that our address information is reflective of our company. So look up the address information for your company if you don't have that handy. I do have that, so I'm just going to go ahead and enter all of that here. Paste in what I need to. And put in my phone number. This information just gets stored, sent over to OpenText and stored on their server. And this is an expiring license, so just be aware of that. It will expire Sunday, September 1st. That means that it's a temporary license. That means that the product will stop working on this expiration date. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If you get permanent keys from OpenText, you need to make sure you install those because otherwise your software will shut down on the expiration date. I'm going to hit the Finish button here. And it should come up with the next install screen now that we've performed the licensing install. And by the way, that license key now resides behind the scenes on this server. That's physically stored in the Windows registry. The only reason you would need to know that is just if you ever do have to move your ECS and Delta software, those license keys you should be aware are installed on the physical machine behind the scenes. And you would need to perform a licensing. Basically, you would unregister your ECS and Delta products through an application called Registration Merlin that's shipped with ECS and Delta and that we can help you find. And you need to unregister your serial numbers before you retire your old ECS and Delta server. Once you unregister those serial numbers, that makes those same serial numbers available to install on a different server. So that's basically how you would migrate your ECS and Delta software to a brand new server if you did need to do that. That's also something that applies if you're doing something crazy to your server that's going to change what's called its MAC address or its IP address. We don't want to do anything to the server that would make it seem like a completely new server because that can cause the licensing to basically void itself and for your product to shut down. So it's not like running a Windows update will do that. In most cases, you don't need to worry, but sometimes we have people do like very dramatic server updates that basically change the server's MAC address or something like that, and their product stops working, and then they have to come to us or go to Liaison for a registration or license bump. So in this case, I can make my, this is my first ECS configuration screen. It's going to ask me for a user account to run the ECS Windows services under. That's 2 Windows services are going to get installed. So I'm going to go ahead and look up my user account password in this case and get that pasted in. And of course, keep your passwords on file and keep them in the safe place so that they can't be compromised by anyone. It goes without saying, but I will say it. And paste in that password. You have to do it twice to confirm it. Again, this is your Windows account that those 2 newly installed Liaison ECS Windows services will run under. So make sure this is a full admin level account and has full admin perms on the server. And in this case, we also want this account to have full permissions on the SQL server to create new databases and so on. So I'm going to hit the next option here. And then it's going to prompt me for an ECS administrator password. So I'm just going to enter that here. And I'm going to make careful note of that password somewhere. Again, keep your passwords safe. You don't want to leave them lying around for anybody to pick up and be able to access. But you do want to make sure that you don't set a password that you're not going to be able to remember later on. So I'm just going to take a moment to make a note of that password that I just set to make sure it's available for me later. Because that's going to be important. We're not going to be able to log into ECS without that password. I'm going to hit next, and now it's going to prompt me with my SQL Server details. This is where that SQL Server is very important. You're noticing it's already defaulting in there, and this is the instance I want to use. But if you're ever in doubt or hung up, make sure that that SQL Server instance is the same SQL Server instance you use to connect in SQL Server Management Studio. So that's what you want that value to be. And you can even copy and paste it directly from this window if you're stumped or stuck. There it is, ECS SQL Server Express. Catalog name is just the database name for the core ECS database. So we're going to leave that set to the default ECS. Port is 1433. Again, that was that TCP IP port that I designated when setting up SQL Server Express earlier. And we can go ahead and let the database provider be as shown here. We don't want the driver, we want the provider. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the next option. We're going to use Windows Integrated Security. Again, we didn't set up SQL Server authentication for the SQL Server instance. That's a more advanced topic and something worth exploring, but I'm just not going to go into it at this time. So we're using Windows Integrated Security. That means that the specific account that you're logged in under is the one that authenticates to the SQL Server used by ECS. I'm going to hit this next option here. And then it's going to ask me if I want to create the catalog. That just means database on server. This is the SQL Server instance, ECS SQL Express. I'm going to say yes. Same thing for the ECS archive database. Remember I said there's two ECS databases that are used with your ECS server, the ECS core database and the ECS archive database. So we're just going to go through these screens and put everything, put all the settings as the same that we already used to set up the core ECS database. So I'm going to hit next. I'm going to use Windows Integrated Security again and hit next. And then yes, I do want to create that catalog or database on this particular SQL Server instance. I'm going to hit next. Now here's where it's going to prompt me for a default archive schedule. The purge schedule is something different. So we'll talk about this in a second. Typically I will set, by default, my ECS archives to run for any data that's older than 365 days or 1 year is going to be placed in the ECS archive database. So it's essentially going to get moved out of your ECS core database, because remember, we don't want that core database to get unmanageable, and it's going to get placed into your ECS archive database. For now, I typically don't set up a purge schedule, but if you set up a purge schedule, basically what this does is it moves data out of your ECS archive database. So again, this will be old data that gets archived from the ECS core database, placed in the ECS archive database. And then once it's purged, that means it's permanently deleted or removed from that ECS archive database. So this is data you definitely no longer need. So you can either set this to a large quantity of days here, and check this box, or you can do what I just did and uncheck the purge data box, and that will by default not set up database purging for the ECS archive database. You can always set that up later too from the ECS Management Console utility. I'm going to hit next, and then this is my ECS web service configuration. Now we're going to we can talk later about ECS and its support for HTTP web services and its support for HTTP protocols like AS2. This is not that. This is basically just the way that client users, for example, can communicate with the ECS server, and also kind of the way that the ECS server communicates with itself. At this time, I typically don't choose the HTTPS option, but you certainly can. If you have a more locked down environment, you may want all the connections to the ECS core web service to be conducted over HTTPS rather than clear HTTP. It's entirely up to you. So keep in mind that this is all internal too. This isn't your trading partners connecting to your server. This is internal people or ECS clients connecting to your ECS server that we're setting up. I'm going to leave everything as is. The default ECS TCP IP port is 3120. And that is important if you have ECS client users in your environment. You want to make sure that this TCP IP port is open on the ECS server and is not blocked by your firewall or similar software. Again, this is just for client connections, so that assumes these are connections in your network. So the maximum JVM size, I've been told by by ECS support, this really shouldn't be above 4,000. They may have changed their requirement because there is typically a lot more memory available on your average Windows server than there used to be. So that's something I can kind of make a note to ask them about at some point. But for now, I'm going to bump that down to 4,000 as the maximum JVM size instead of leaving it set to that 8,000 plus value. And you can always change this later just by firing up the ECS install package again. I'm going to hit finish now. And that was the last of the database, the ECS database screens, or what we call kind of collectively the ECS database configuration screens. We're just going to let it run and do its thing and install components. And it's going to take a little bit of time. And this is just a standard warning. It's nothing to be concerned about. It's prompting you with a prompt about existing Delta maps. You don't have any existing Delta maps, so you really don't need to worry about this prompt. This is just for a certain type of legacy user that's upgrading ECS rather than for a clean ECS install like we're doing together right now. I'm going to hit the OK option just to confirm I saw the prompt. And we're going to let this finish running. We have this option to start the liaison ECS services. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the finish button and let those start. We get a success response, which means that the service did start. Or in fact, both services, because remember there are two services that ECS installs. The next thing that I'm going to do is start installing Delta. I'm going to do that before I even open any of the utilities. Just because ECS and Delta work in tandem, it's really best to start configuring from a place where both applications are installed instead of installing ECS first and trying to do any kind of configuration and then installing Delta later. You want to install them both one after the other. And you always want to install ECS first as well. So I'm going to do the same with my Delta install. I'm going to choose the Run as Administrator option. Again, that just ensures that I'm running under those elevated Windows admin permissions. I'm going to hit my Run Anyway option. Again, you don't need to worry about that standard Windows prompt that gets thrown up there. You can just click on past it. Has to do with signing certificates or the like. And just probably means that the cert is old or perhaps doesn't exist in the cert stores that was used to sign that executable that we downloaded from the eService website. You saw those prompts just indicating components being installed. You can go ahead and let those run on through. And I think the next thing we're going to see here is the licensing screen. So we'll give it a moment to show up. I'm just going to make sure that I have my licensing information handy. I'm going to accept the terms of this license agreement. And I'm going to stop my ECS service in the next screen. Because we're installing Delta and that kind of works on the ECS configuration, we do need to stop that ECS service, and the Delta install will politely prompt you to do that. So you do need to stop ECS before you finish the Delta install. I'm going to hit that button. And it should return with a prompt telling me that the service was either able to be stopped or couldn't be stopped. There it is. It was stopped. So the next thing I'm going to do is hit next. And it prompts me, do you want to install Delta Studio, Engine, or Runtime? Pretty much what you're always going to choose is Delta Studio. The Delta Studio component is basically your component that lets you look at and edit and install Delta maps. The Delta Engine component is what runs with ECS and causes those maps to execute in your ECS runtime environment. So these are two separate components. They're licensed separately. Conceivably, you could install Delta Studio on someplace other than your ECS server. But Delta Engine always needs to be installed physically on the ECS server because it's required to run maps in production in the ECS application. So know that this is mandatory. Delta Studio could be installed elsewhere as long as you install on a server that can connect to the ECS server on the network. But for our purposes, we're going to install both components, the Delta Studio map editing component and the Delta Engine ECS workhorse component on the same ECS server. So I'm going to hit next and choose my Delta Studio install. We'll discuss why in a moment, but we always install Delta Studio first if we know we're installing them both. Next thing I'm going to do is enter my username again, my company name again. Oops. And then my serial number I'm going to paste in from the documentation that Liaison sent over to us. Again, this has to be the right component, so I want to make sure that that's my Delta Studio serial number that I'm pasting in and not the wrong component. Again, it's 2 separate licenses for Studio and Engine for Delta. And you notice this is defaulting in from my ECS registration, which is good. Everything except the serial number defaults in, including the address information I already looked up and entered before. It's just a nice little convenience that you don't have to enter it again. And again, here's an expiration date. You want to be aware that the software license will expire on that date. So you want to make sure that if OpenText gives you a permanent serial number, that you do install that before this expiration date comes. I'm going to hit the finish option. And here it's going to prompt me for the engine installation. Remember I said we install Delta Studio always when we're installing 2 components, and that just prevents us from having to go back through that install and install Delta Studio as a separate install step. This is going to let me register both components in a single install. So I'm going to go ahead and find my Delta Engine serial number and paste it in. Like so. I'm going to hit the next option. I'm going to hit next. I'm going to just verify my address information that I already entered, and I'm going to hit the OK button. And again, take note of that expiration date and hit the finish option. At this point, it's going to prompt me for install locations and so on. So I'm going to leave that destination folder set to the default in Program Files. I'm going to create a desktop icon. You don't have to, but I tend to leave these set to the default settings unless there's something I need to change. Here we can use this. This is what we call our map and model repository. Maps are stored, maps and models for Delta are stored physically on this server, but they're also stored in the ECS database when you deploy them to production. So that's something to keep in mind. These are files on the server, but once you install them in ECS mode, they do get stored in the database. And that's a topic of a discussion for another day when we talk about editing and installing maps. I'm going to hit the next option, and that should take care of installing those remaining Delta components. And again, it's going to prompt me to start the ECS service because remember we stopped it together. I'm going to hit that yes option, and it's going to say it was started. And it should take me to my final screen. And now it's going to want me to launch Liaison Delta. So I'm going to leave that checked because I do want to launch Delta. We'll do some quick configuration as well as just verifying that ECS install took place. Because we're using Delta Enterprise, it is prompting us for Solution Manager. You won't receive this prompt if you're installing Delta Standard because it doesn't have the Solution Manager component. But I'm going to click yes so that I don't keep getting this option later on. Here's where I have to enter my ECS server information. ECS is the name of my Windows server that I know ECS is installed on. I know it's confusing because it's also the application name. So you will put whatever your Windows server name is that you installed the ECS product on. I'm going to leave this box checked set as my default server. I'm going to enter my password here that I set up for ECS and took note of earlier. And I'm going to choose a role for this server. I'm going to make it my production server. And I'm going to hit OK. And if you don't get an error, that means it was able to connect to ECS. So this is good news. That means our ECS server is up and running. I'm going to hit the OK option again here. It says it doesn't have the tables configured yet, and it prompts me to create them. This is, again, for the Solution Manager component. You're only going to see this for Delta Enterprise, and you only have to set up this table once. I believe it's once per Windows user that you log into Delta Studio under. So I'm going to hit yes. The tables are successfully configured, so this is all good news. And this is my Delta Studio. Again, this is the map editing component. You'll see it installs with some nice sample maps. You can open those, you can play around with them if you want. Navigating and using Delta is a topic for another day, but it's a nice intuitive mapper, and I'm sure that you will love it and enjoy and appreciate it as we all do here. So I'm going to close out of Delta Studio, and we're just going to make sure that ECS was successfully installed. ECS doesn't install any kind of shortcuts, unlike Delta that installs a Delta Studio shortcut on your desktop by default. ECS kind of keeps those ECS utilities hidden behind the scenes until you create shortcuts to them. So the two that you're going to want to create shortcuts to are ECS MC, which is ECS Management Console. So I'm going to pin that to my start menu. I'm going to just pin that to my toolbar or taskbar as well in Windows. And I'm going to launch ECS Management Console and just take a look at it and make sure that ECS installed as it should have. Just take a look around. And yes, it looks like our ECS install completed as expected. And here in SQL Server Management Studio, I'm going to do a quick refresh so you can see those databases being created. And there's my ECS and ECS archive databases created. You can see them now. The second ECS utility that you should create a shortcut to is Data Administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that to the Start menu. Again, these utilities are physically reside in the ECS bin directory on your ECS server. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this to my taskbar as well. I'm going to open up the ECS Management Console. There's not much to see because we haven't actually sent any data through ECS, but this is what the ECS Data Administrator utility looks like. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, shoot us an email or a comment and we will be happy to follow up with you. But as you can see, ECS and Delta is fairly easy software to install if you're looking for an on-premise EDI solution, and pretty intuitive to use and configure as well. So yeah, hope that helps.